Mr. Rohit Malhotra, thank you so much for being here. We truly appreciate you coming down.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Sorry for my raspy voice. I had a lot of fun at Pride. So
That's
it was good.
okay. Hey,
Yeah.
that Pride is meant to have fun,
Yeah.
and that is a clear indication
It's
of
beautiful.
it.
Yes.
I want to talk about somewhere else where your voice was used quite a bit, and that was at the recent Atlanta Press Club debate.
Yes.
Coming fresh out of that debate, I want to just hear about your thoughts going face to face with Councilmember Overstreet, and just what were your biggest takeaways from that conversation, that debate?
Yeah, I think that I take any opportunity, any space that I'm in, as a chance for people to hear about my vision for Atlanta. And I think that over the course of the conversation and the debate, I was able to share with folks that, Atlanta is in a moment where we require better, stronger public policy. And that for a lot of people, status quo politics is not working. But we can't just be against someone or against something. I think that the future of politics is mandating us to be for something. And so, for me, I got to talk a lot about affordability and how that's so important for me, about small businesses, about making sure that we're talking about transit and that we can see it in our lifetime, and talking about the protection of our democracy in a time like now. So I'm very proud of the fact that we could do politics a little bit differently rather than just telling the public everything is working, actually painting a vision of what public policy could look like in the city of Atlanta.
I know you came after Councilmember Overstreet's record when it comes to just that, making sure that things are done right and not just kind of following along here. Part of that debate, you did come for her given experience. Even though she has been serving the city, there are still certain issues with the city. What is your, I don't want to say message to her, but message to the voters as to why you believe that you will do better, even though you don't necessarily have that political experience, but you do have experience working on the ground?
Yeah, I think the experience that people are looking for, particularly voters, is not how long you've been in politics, but what you've done. I have, a decade plus of work that I have done in public service. I'm not entering politics to enter public service. I'm looking to put public service back into our politics. And for me, I have spent the past 10 years running an organization called the Center for Civic Innovation. I have worked in the federal government. I have worked in the Office of Management and Budget. I understand how public policy works. I understand the legislative side, the budget side, and the research and data that I have worked on over the course of the past decade is research and data that has been used across every mayoral administration, across council member after council member, because that's what public policy is supposed to be like. It is in the weeds, it is detailed. For me, I think it's good that there is a track record. I think we should look at votes and we should say, what is a person saying? And then how did they actually vote? Who are they saying they stand for? But then who are they standing alongside? I think that those things really matter. We have gotten obsessed with the idea that the only way to enter politics is to be in politics. But I think that we are in a moment where politics as usual has not been serving communities in the way that it should. In the past decade, income inequality in the city of Atlanta has gotten wider than it's ever been. Upward mobility in Atlanta is the worst in the country. That's not a record that I would be very proud of. I think that that is something that, if that is something we want to tackle, I want to see what are the interventions that over the course of the past 10 years has council actually done to be able to move the needle forward. Now, there are some things that have been working, but I think when you look at my record and what I've done to tackle and push on income inequality and economic mobility outside of government gives you a pretty good glimpse of what I'm going to be like as a leader inside of government as well.
Thank you for that. If I could pivot to the police funding in the
Sure.
city, as well as the police training facility that was a bit controversial depending on who you ask.
Yeah.
I want to know your thoughts, and if you could just put it out for us plain. There have been some that have criticized your thoughts, your rhetoric around funding for police. In your words, what are your thoughts when it comes to police funding, defunding, how much money should go to them? Your words, plain and simple, right here.
Yeah, I think it is always irresponsible when we try to paint things as a false binary, that things can only be this or that. When I think about public safety, I think about it in the same way that I think about public health. It is an outcome. It is something that we are striving toward. And it does not matter what neighborhood or community that you are in Atlanta, everyone wants to feel safe. Now, the definition of how a community feels safe does differ based on community to community. There are some communities where policing is the answer that they are looking for. For other communities, safety might mean, can my grandma go from point A to point B on a sidewalk that randomly ends because she's in a wheelchair and we can't get there? Or can I go outside and play basketball with my kids? Public safety should never be a binary conversation of, do you believe this or do you believe that? I think that public policy is nuanced. So let me be just very explicit. The rhetoric of painting me as defund the police or anti-police, because I believe in the reimagination of public safety, is not only inaccurate, it is dangerous. We have to stop doing this. This is exactly what people are tired of in politics. That when people want to call for reform, which, by the way, the phrase defund the police came after George Floyd was murdered. And everybody, corporations, community organizations, residents of Atlanta took and marched peacefully and said, we want change. We want reform. This is not working for us. And I think to pretend like that never happened and to say that the only option is are you for or against the police? As opposed to saying, I believe that policing is a part of a comprehensive approach to public safety. It tells me when people do that, it also tells me that they likely have never actually had a conversation with police officers. Because if you talk to a lot of police officers, many of whom are my age, for a lot of them, this is not what they signed up for. They are taking on a lot of responsibilities that hospital systems and community-based organizations are saying we can be helpful in this. There should be a coordinated effort on how we do this. And I think in the city of Atlanta, we have pinned the wrong people up against each other. To be for reform and reimagination and community-based violence interruption work is not to be anti-police. But also, if you've ever sat with a mother who has lost their child to gun violence, and if that gun violence has happened because a police officer misidentified their child, if you've ever sat with someone like that, you can come to the understanding and the empathy that someone may not believe in the police department as much as we would want them to. It is not our obligation to say to that person, well, you are wrong. What you feel doesn't apply, that your pain is invalid. I think that being a good public leader is about holding all of those truths, that there are people whose lives have been saved because of a police officer, and there are also people whose lives have been taken. And when you can hold all of that, then we could say, so what does public safety look like? And I don't think every time we talk about public safety that we should just conflate that as a policing conversation. Again, policing is a part of a larger conversation. Public safety is the outcome we want to achieve. But we also need to talk about public health. We need to talk about infrastructure. We need to talk about environment. We need to talk about the criminalization of poverty. I think most of Atlanta agrees on this if we're willing to not have the salacious conversation of just like trying to pin a person as this or that. I'm a policy expert. I've spent my career in public policy. And when I look at other cities and how they are approaching public safety, it aligns with the way that I'm talking about this. If you look at Baltimore and you look at Birmingham, these are two mayors that have been applauded for their approaches on public safety. But it has also required a multi-million-dollar investment in alternatives, in diversion programs, in safety programs that are community-centered, and they've seen massive reductions in violence in their cities. I want to see that for Atlanta. And I think that it is good and healthy for us to have debate on what public safety could look like so we can get it right. Because when it goes wrong, it can cost people their lives. So I think it's worth us having this conversation and not creating a villainous and false narrative about what people who are calling for reform are actually saying.
Thank you for that. I want to just follow up on that question in terms to if you were to win this seat, you'd obviously have a close relationship with whoever the mayor of Atlanta will be, if it is Mayor Andre Dickens, and if you do have that seat, how will you navigate that relationship, even on instances like this where you all don't necessarily see eye to eye?
Yeah, I think that's the beauty of democratic process. And actually, I have had these types of conversations with Mayor Dickens when he was Councilmember Dickens. These are the types of debates, the types of policy conversations that we need to have. The goal of public policy is not to agree on everything. I think that sets a false reality to the public, as if good governance means rubber stamping and just agreeing that we have to all move at the beat of the same drum. Good public policy, particularly on the legislative side of government, which is the side of government that I'm running for. I'm not running for mayor. I am running for city council president. And city council president is an independent policy office on the legislative side of government. And the legislative side of government is responsible for the arbitration, the debate, the pushing, the pulling of budgets and legislation. I love that. That is where I thrive. So my job is to make sure that we have good public policy that the executive branch of government can look at and say, yes, that's a great way to look at this. That if the executive branch of government is making sure that our police departments are strong, then they should have a legislative branch of government that says, okay, let's also make sure that our diversion programs are strong. If you have an executive branch of government that is saying, here are some roads that infrastructure projects that we want to prioritize, I think you need a legislative branch of government that says, here are some roads that may have been left out. Here are some communities who have been asking to be heard as well. I love representative democracy for this exact reason. But when those two things are not independent, when the executive branch and the legislative branch are not operating as two independent entities, and instead you are watching one rubber stamp the other, it is not only an ineffective way to do governance, it can be an inappropriate way to do governance. Because when you think about committee assignments, which is a role and responsibility for the city council president, if there is someone who, if the executive office has something that they really want to push through, or let's forget them for a second, and say a lobbyist for the executive office really wants to push something through, if they have a direct line to be able to influence the city council president, you could end up having committee assignments where legislation is either getting passed without appropriate review, or legislation is getting stalled without appropriate discussion. I think that the independence of this office is so important, and it will make the executive branch better and stronger, in addition to restoring the role and responsibility of the legislative branch. There's a lot of council members who what they can say publicly is different than what they say privately. And a lot of that comes from not villainous activity. Oftentimes when we think about government, it sometimes gets painted as good people versus bad people. But for a lot of people, they're scared that if I say the thing, then that project I've been working on for a few months may get booted to the side or pushed to the side. Retaliation is a real thing. I think that the council president is responsible for ensuring that independence so that council members can dream up legislation and programs for their respective districts, and also balance that with the executive office, not report to the executive office. So last thing is that the city council president does not report to the mayor. The city council president does not report to the council. The city council president reports to the people. And that is why this role and responsibility is elected by the entire city of Atlanta. It is not elected by the council. It is not appointed by the mayor. It is decided on by the people. So it needs to be an independent voice that understands community through and through. And I think I'm the right person for that.
Thank you for that answer.
Yep.
What do you see as your biggest political liability or vulnerability in this race?
Yeah, well, you know, as folks like to say, I'm not an insider, right? I'm not the guy who has been spending my entire career thinking about running for public office. And what you learn when you run for public office is how many compromises a lot of political leaders make along the way of being elected. That comes to their donors. It comes to people who are saying, if you do this, then I'll do this for you. There's a lot of quid pro quo. There's also a lot of people who make money from the city of Atlanta with contracts that they have. And you can't get mad at them because for a lot of them, they're like, this is my livelihood. I got this contract. I have to stay in good relationship with status quo politics.
Are you saying that there's certain council members that are doing this?
Doing what?
This quid pro quo in the
Oh,
city?
I think that you can look at you can look at council member disclosures and you can see who is giving them dollars. You do the math, right? Which is that if a council member is receiving donations, max out donations, year after year, from donors who have security contracts with the city of Atlanta. When that security contract comes up for a vote, do you believe that council member should be allowed to vote on that piece of legislation if their donor is now getting a contract with the city of Atlanta? We see this happen all the time. It's happened recently. And so when we look at disclosures, I think it's very important to figure out who it is that elected officials are accountable to. And to me, I'm accountable to the people. I'm accountable to the communities that I represent. So I think the greatest vulnerability is that every single step of the way, especially for progressives who are running for office, you are met with the challenge of, if you don't fall in line, if you don't play the game the way it is supposed to be played, then we're going to ensure that you lose. Or we're going to put lies on your name. As you've mentioned, you've talked about public safety. But for a lot of people who even dare to prompt the conversation about public safety looking possibly different, we are threatened because of that. Our safety is threatened because of that. A whole set of emails were sent out by my opponent's campaign that said that I'm a threat to public safety merely because we've invested in organizations that worked on Mothers Against Gang Violence, like making sure that kids have an alternative place to go, making sure that families who are paying for funeral services for their children who they have to bury. That to me is not a threat to public safety. It is a requirement for public safety to exist. So I think that because I don't play the game in the way that Atlanta is used to the game being played, it is now become a threat to existing power. And I think that, here's the good news. I think that most voters, when I'm on the ground, and I'm on the ground every single day, every minute I can be on the ground, I'm on the ground. When I talk to people, they're like, this has to change. Their trust in both any level of government, whether it is the local government or their federal government, is at historic lows. And you can see that represented in our abysmally low voter turnout. You have less than 20% of people voting in local elections. And for a lot of people, when you knock on their door, they're like, yeah, I know there's an election, but why would I participate? When every time I want to be heard, every time my community has said, I'd like to see change, we're always told maybe later. But when it comes to political season, then all of a sudden, the courage exists to be able to talk about the challenges that these communities are facing. We are able to find expedited solutions to projects that were stalled for years.
So you're saying people aren't practicing what they're preaching on the campaign trail?
Oh, I know that to be true. Yes, people do not practice what they preach in politics, which is why people don't trust politics anymore. I'm not saying that people need perfect politicians, but what they're demanding is authentic ones. They're demanding people to be truthful, to be honest, to be transparent. And that when you get it wrong, because you inevitably will, if you humanize people in public service, you understand that you have to apply some grace and we have to make sure sometimes they get it wrong. But when you get it wrong, I think a leader is defined on how they behave in that moment. Not when things are going great, but when things are truly difficult. We had an Office of Inspector General in the city of Atlanta that was established under the previous administration to make sure that we could have conversations around fraud, waste, abuse, corruption, all the things that I was talking about. Whether there are people who are making deals, people who are maybe going into contract, or if you're an employee of the city of Atlanta, which I've talked to dozens of employees in the city of Atlanta, who do they go to now if something doesn't feel right or if they experience unfair retaliation? We used to have an Office of Inspector General, and the person I'm running against led the charge to dismantle that office. And this is not, to me, now that, and still to this day, you can check me on this, to this day, there is not a running board, an oversight board for the Office of the Inspector General, because no one wants to be a part of it. No one wants to touch it, because we've now put fear into people about even going to the office that we established to be able to provide ethics and transparency. This is the type of culture I want to change. And I think the legislative branch of government is the right place to start.
All right. Mr. Rohit Malhotra, is there anything that I did not ask you for, kind of like see this as a last word to the people who are watching this interview that you would like to touch on in about 60 seconds?
Sure, yes. So I'm grateful for the time. I'm so proud to be running for this office. I love this city, and public policy for me is my love language. I have an expertise in legislation, in budgets, in policy and advocacy. This is also deeply personal for me. You know, my parents are working class folks who struggle to survive in this city, and they represent so many other people in this city who are just trying to make it. And so as much as I think the public, as much as I think we are asked questions often about what we are against, I constantly want to remind people that this is a campaign of hope. It is a campaign that is focused on affordability, making sure that like families and small businesses that are in Atlanta today can see themselves in Atlanta tomorrow. That when we're making promises on things like transit or water or infrastructure, that we're following through on those promises. That when we talk about public safety, that we make sure that we talk about all of public safety and all it means and all of its opportunity, including ending gun violence, which is the leading cause of death for children. But the last thing is that we are in a national crisis moment right now. We need leaders who are not going to stay silent in a moment like now. Democracy is under attack, but a lot of people, based on their identity, are afraid. And they are asking the question of, will my city protect me? Will my city have my back? And I think that silence can be complicity. It can be complacency. I will not be silent about the fact that Atlanta is worth fighting for, that we have to make sure that we stand up against authoritarian governments while also protecting the people who are here. That to me is my charge. That is public service in a moment like now. When people ask themselves how they would have shown up during national atrocities that have existed throughout history, I think you're finding out right now. How we show up right now in this moment will define what history looks like in the future. And I knew for me that I'm running for office to make sure I am proud of the way that I've showed up in this moment in history and that we are building a better future for the next generation in this city.
Mr. Rohit Malhotra, thank you so much for being here. We truly appreciate it.
I'm grateful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Go Falcons.